Make that big boss less special. It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level. Second level. Second level gaming. Second level.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to the last session of the day. It's really good to see you all. What we're about to see over the next 50 minutes or so, we're going to hear from 5 different developers who are going to do a quick 10-minute micro talk over experimental aesthetics in games. So how do we push ourselves as creators and that sort of thing. First, we have Robin Baumgarten. Take it away, Robin.
That's right.
Hello.
Cool, yeah. So in this short talk, I'm just going to go through some of my projects and then going to go into, depending on how much time we have, into the detail of one of the projects and like how I solve problems and how kind of making real physical games informs the aesthetics of the game, like kind of how people interact with it changes what we do with games. So this is me. I studied computer science and then did mobile games for a while and then got kind of fairly accidentally into experimental hardware games. So I hadn't done any electrical engineering, so it's all learning by doing. But that's very easy these days, and I think I have a slide on that as well. But first, I'm going to go through a couple of projects that I did. So this is my first hardware project, basically. It's called a dozen sliders. It's boxes of motorized sliders. They look like this. I don't know how to turn this down. Yeah, so there was a filmed at GDC, so it's a bit noisy. But you can see they move by themselves. They have little motors in them. Wait, oh, I have a laser pointer. Cool. No, it's off. OK. But yeah, so it was only 8 of them because I was too lazy to make the last 4, basically, but nobody really noticed. So it's kind of like a local multiplayer kind of thing, so it's touch sensitive. And it was a cool experience because I was at the first iteration of Alt Control GDC, so that's an alternative controller exhibition at GDC in San Francisco, so it's quite new. I think it started only like 4 years ago. But it's a quite cool way to show your experimental hardware stuff. And that's kind of how I got into this whole thing. So that's how I met all other cool hardware developers like Jerry, who's going to talk in a bit. From then on, basically, I kind of continued and made a lot of weird projects. For example, this one was made at the Global Game Jam there. Basically starting with like a weird input. Like, for example, this is like a rubber band. I don't know if you can see it over the light. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. And when you stretch it, it changes resistance, and then you can measure that, and it's fed back into Unity physics simulation. So it's kind of little blobs flying around. It's not too much of a game to it. It's just kind of they go, ooh. It was quite fun. That was also an interesting project. Well, maybe I didn't really have time to talk about this, but it did really well on Twitter, but it plays kind of terribly. So it's kind of a nice asymmetry between how nice something looks and how well it actually plays. Because a lot of people, when I gave it to them, they went like up with it, because like I had this simulation of throwing things up, but obviously it didn't measure up, it just measured stretch. So it's kind of an interesting thing when you design things, like how does something you actually simulate with the sensor you do affect the play style, right? So it's like it needs to be like a really one-to-one relationship often, or at least that's what I found. And that's what I kind of changed in later games. This is another cool experiment I did. Sorry for the... Can we turn down the volume? Don't really need sound for this. Yes, thanks. So this is about finding an invisible cat on a touch panel, which is a touch screen without a screen. And we have this vibration glove on there, so when you're really close to the cat, it starts purring, so it vibrates. And then when you find the cat, it kind of purrs really strong, and then there's like this little band that kind of flashes up when you do find it. Like, yeah, perfect. So this was actually made on a train. This was made on the train jam last year, I think. So you see, yeah, going from Chicago to San Francisco. This happens every year. If you're going to GDC, I highly recommend doing this. This is like one of the best game dev experiences I've had, full stop. Best game jams also. It's kind of nice. Oh yeah, here's a making of. I think there's Jerry as well in the background somewhere going boop. Let's wait for that. Let's see if that happens. Wasting my time here, but it's important. Here goes. Boop, boop. Can't hear it. Sounds too loud. So this is an interesting game with an actual French kitchen knife on a motor, and the task is to hold your finger in between it. So this is a cooperative game. You play against the machine. You have to hold all buttons as long as you can, and the machine is trying to prevent it. It's also touch sensitive, so when it notices a touch, it actually it cuts stronger. You can see it sometimes, like here. I actually exhibited this at the EGX Expo in London, and I think it flew under the radar, so no one asked me to sign any waivers. They probably should have. But so it turns out, so this hasn't actually hurt anyone yet, so it's like a fairly safe thing. I would like to say by design, but it was mostly by accident. It's kind of, oh yeah, it doesn't cut, cool, we can actually use it. But yeah, so I don't really show this much now because it's kind of, you know, someday people might get hurt and you don't actually want that. But it's a cool, like, you know, it's a kind of this freedom you get to experiment with kind of weird things with the expectation of pain. So it wasn't really that painful. It was just like people didn't know that, and it looks kind of sharp, right? So the expectation of pain is an interesting concept that hasn't been explored too much. I mean, there's a pain station, which you might have heard of. So this is a newest project I'm working on. It's called Baumgarten. This is like 36 door stopper springs that are touch sensitive and have like these LED rings around them. And it's a platform for a lot of different things. So this was like a finger twister where each player has a different color. There's like a music game that makes different sounds. But this is very new, so I haven't really quite figured out what exactly I'm going to do with this. But this is kind of the sequel of another game I built before, which I'm going to go into in a bit. But before that happens, I'm just going to have a brief interlude on that hardware is really hot right now, and it's because a lot of things. There's like, it's easier to use than ever before, so there's a lot of things that have come out and make it really easy to get started with hardware stuff. So I've never, you know, learned anything about hardware, just about software. But for example, there was a Makey. You don't need any knowledge, so you can just plug one end into like a banana and the other one in a computer, and suddenly it's a keyboard. So it's like left and right buttons. It's like two bananas or whatever. It just needs to conduct electricity, and then you do as well. So you can also play it with humans. So it's a kind of really cool way to get started, and then it kind of just gets a bit more complex from there. Maybe I've heard of the Raspberry Pi. That's a full-blown Linux computer for $4. It's crazy cheap. It's easier to buy, better hardware, but it's also the communities that make it much better. So, for example, I'm part of the London Hackspace, which is a hackspace in London, which is basically a communal workshop. So people can join it, and then they can use all the facilities like laser cutters, 3D printers. But a lot of times people just come to hang out and give advice to other people, and that's how you can learn about anything you like. So, for example, I learned a lot about like spring design in that space, and I'll show you a video later of that. But also online communities are really good. So like if you want to use any kind of sensor, you just need to Google like, you know, Arduino stretch sensor, and then say, oh yeah, you should use this product here. This is how you hook it up. Here's some example code, and it gets you going in no time. So it's really cool and easy to get started. And it's also easy to get noticed now. So I talked to you about the Alt Control Expo, but then also, you know, like just normal video game expos like this one have alternative controller games. So my game's over in the other room. I don't know if you've seen it. Line Wobbler is this one-dimensional dungeon crawler. In fact, it's, I think, the next slide. Yes. So this is the game. If you haven't seen it, it's basically a game where you control a little green light and you go up this one-dimensional line. You control the light and you can fight enemies on the way by wobbling the spring controller. And once you reach the top, it goes to the next stage. So you can see the controller down there. Just go a bit quicker here. Yeah, so then a few words on like how this game came to be, basically, or how I iterated through this game, basically by showing it at different exhibitions. So this is actually the original inspiration for the game. This is a cat playing with a doorstopper spring. It's not my cat, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, because I think apparently this cat does it every morning at 5 a.m. And I thought, wow, if a cat can have so much fun playing with a doorstopper spring, maybe humans can too. And it took me a while to figure out the right sensor to use and how to kind of build it. In the end, I ended up using an accelerometer in the top. So I measure basically how far you bend the spring. So like, direction of gravity changes, which is an acceleration. Yeah, so I had the idea for this joystick first, basically, so just a spring. And then at a game jam, someone else brought an LED strip and said, hey, let's combine the two, let's see what happens. And basically, these were our design limitations. And they basically defined the game entirely. So we said, OK, we have a debug output of like how far you bend the spring. That's kind of a little dot that moves. And then when you flick the spring, it kind of shakes erratically. And so it's like, oh, this could be an attack. This looks fairly violent. If it's an attack, we have enemies. OK, then we have a moving thing and enemies. Oh, my time's up already. So then I showed this game, basically embedded in the 3D world. I made a Christmas tree version out of it at King's Cross. That was cool. And then the springs were kind of terrible in the beginning. So I had these doorstopper springs. But they weren't good enough. So I went to a spring factory and had springs made. It's very loud. That made my springs, basically. That was a cool experience because they didn't know anything about games. I didn't know anything about springs. I have a GDC talk where I go more into detail about this, but I gave it 2 years ago. I think it's free online, so you can see more about this. There's another cat helper in the hack space, actually. One day I want to put some catnip in the controller, so one cat controls the joystick and the other one hunts the light. But that's basically it. So thanks for listening. All right. Should give you this. Do you want to? Yeah, maybe you go first. Do you have any pen?
Oh, yeah, let me get this there. Okay. So button, huh? Okay. Hi, I'm Priscilla Snow. I have a slide. If I wait. Oh no. Thank you. Forward, maybe? Ah, there we go. Okay, so a little bit about me. My background is actually in theater. I did theater before I came to games. I first worked on a game in 2014. It was a short twine game, The Dome of Oy, and then Beneath Flows. And both of those are free to play online if you ever want to check them out. Most recently, I composed the soundtrack for Voyager by Bruno Diaz. It's a fantastic procedurally generated text game about exploring space. Definitely check that out. And currently, I'm working on The Silence Under Your Bed, Southern Monsters, Memory Blocks, and a game for the University of Arkansas. So that's a little bit about my background. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually semi-related to Robin's talk. It's about experimenting with hardware in relation to audio. So I compose and work in games, and I also do a little bit of live performance with experimental music and that kind of thing. And they actually end up relating to each other a lot more often than I would have thought. So this was kind of my first foray into making custom hardware. This is a hacked VGA cable that I soldered from scratch, put all of it together, and I put it in a Dolce & Gabbana box because it fit, it looked nice. And essentially, I was able to connect the audio inputs to the red, blue, and green pins in the VGA cable and use that to react to whatever music I put through it. So, I have a video here. Let's see how, saying request access. Oh no. I might be able to share it. Request access. Let's see how this goes. Need permission. Yes, I have my email on my laptop here, so I should be able to grant access. I'm granting access. This is some live troubleshooting. Send. Okay, shared with one person. Yay! Technology, guys. It's great. That was pretty experimental, you know. So I'm tuning my theremin here. And it's controlling the width of the waveform on the TVs. And I say it's tuned at the end. So this was at an experimental art show where I played music for like 3 hours. It was a lot. Everything was being shown on the TV. I was routing my webcam through it. It was really fun. It was probably one of the most fun shows I've played, and that was earlier this year. Go ahead and hit. There we go. Yeah, and so kind of where I link that to is I just kind of started doing that on a whim. I just decided, like, I really like soldering, and I'm going to do this thing, and I went with it. And I had a lot of fun, and I learned a lot. And one of the things I enjoy doing with games is kind of doing the same thing, where I have an idea, I don't know how to do it, and I'm just going to try it. And that's where I get a lot of like really like off-the-wall ideas happening. And if anyone's interested in that VGA cable thing, it's on crackedraytube.com. So I found it on a forum. So more directly related to game design, like I was saying, I usually will come up with an idea for something and just kind of go on a tangent and dedicate some time to it, even if I don't think it's going to end up being something I use in a project. Because a lot of times I'll learn enough along the way that it informs something later on down the road. One of the kind of silly things I've done with Southern Monsters is this is a horror game. It's coming out this year. We've been working on it for 3 years. And the antagonist of the game is a taxidermy snow goose that is on the wall of your bedroom. And you have nightmares about him every night. It's a really good relationship you have going with this taxidermy snow goose. And essentially, I was like, how do I incorporate him into the sound design like more directly? And I was playing around with extracting raw data in Audacity. That's something you can put any kind of file in there, extract the raw data, and it takes that data and turns it into a sound. So I found a PDF of a folklore story about snow goose, and I put it into Audacity and got this. It sounded like dial-up, and I thought that was kind of funny because I actually needed a dial-up sound for the game because it's set in the early internet days. So in the end, we actually have to request access again. But we ended up actually getting a usable sound from just like a random like creative tangent I went on. And me request access again here. We should have access now. I love how quick that is. So it was a little hard to hear. But by doing that, I got a lot of different variations to use, and it all sounds like very convincing dial-up, which it's just something that happened. So that's something I talk a lot about when I'm teaching, because I do a lot of teaching game development with kids. I've worked in schools in Northwest Arkansas. And I always tell them, like, find something you're interested in, whether it's writing or sound or programming, and just try something. It doesn't matter if you think it's actually going to work or if it's going to show up in your game. Just going on these random tangents and following kind of a stream of consciousness approach to design, I find is usually like pretty fruitful, sometimes more fruitful than like having an idea and not knowing how to do it and just feeling like you're banging your head against a wall. So I always recommend just like giving yourself a little room to explore, giving yourself room to like make mistakes and mess up, and keep trying and just like go on these creative tangents, and you you might end up getting usable material out of it. You might come up with your next game, your next unexpected element in a soundtrack or sound design. So, yeah, thanks.
Hi. I hope I can, okay. Hi, I'm Emperatriz. I'm from the Southwest, and I'm a game designer and writer. So I'll just wait a minute for the slides to start, but excited to be here today and hear everyone's talks and play everyone's games. Yay, poetry. That's what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about poetry. So I'm a poet, and I like to experiment with media. I got my start studying 20th century experimental poetry, and I was always curious about what makes a text or a poet or a writer difficult, unreadable, illegible, or weird. Yes, so here's some examples of some poets. From left to right, this is Bob Cobbing, Charles Bernstein, and Jen Bervin. And there's some examples of visual poets who experiment with different kinds of techniques, like erasure poetry, or just playing around with space and legibility. And so there are examples of games that use poetry and are poetic. They're abundant, and they're not limited to these examples, but this includes Milkmaid of the Milky Way, Child of Light. What Remains of Edith Finch also uses poems, and so does Dear Esther. And I also have used rhyme in games, where I was a narrative designer. So this one is called Yumi's Home. It was a game about depression. And we would use these more traditional forms of poetry in these interstitials between games. And there were also parts that were more poetic, but the lines weren't formed in traditional verse. They were poetic lines, but they weren't comprised in a traditional verse paragraph. So I'm talking about some of my work. This was generative Stein. I spent a good 3 years really invested and in love with, with Gertrude Stein. So this project was a generative Stein. Here I had started in processing, and with this particular version of the project, each click on the screen generated a new lines based on sentence structure and a collection of nouns. And as I continued to work on the project, it migrated to Twitter as a Twitter poetry bot. The goal of this particular project was to pressurize the nouns while maintaining the structure of Gertrude Stein's sentences in her own poem. She wrote, poetry is concerned with using, with abusing, with losing, with wanting, with denying, with avoiding, with adoring, with replacing the noun. So questions guiding this particular project were, does Stein's writing still maintain a poetic ring if the nouns are in constant shifting state? Does the regeneration of poetic lines cause instability in the reading of the work? And how does this all translate if the pattern is placed into a programming environment? Flash forward, I was trying to use more game-like tools to experiment with poetry, and this is how some of my work progressed to be in conversation with current events and forms of experimental found poetry, erasure poetry, and blackout poetry. This is an example called What to Do If You're Stopped by the Police. It was done with a group of folks that we got together on Discord for Resist Jam in 2017. And it combined original poetry, like my own original poetry, with content from the American Civil Liberties Union, the Oxford English Dictionary, and other news sources. Yeah, and it was done in Twine. And the next project I was working on trying to make things a little more personal. So this one is called What Should I Be? It was done in P5 Play. And while there's a lot of procedural generation happening with some of the, while there's a lot of procedural generation being done with writers, also I was interested in mimicking it with a more guided and hand-selected experience. So this is a short poetry game about sexuality where players create a poem based on floating thought clouds. And you kind of scrub away the thought clouds, and a different poem appears at the end of each experience. So kind of going along the lines of where I'm headed next with experimenting with poetry, and also what's been done. These are some examples from the early 2000s of where the worlds of electronic literature, digital humanities, and art games collide. This was an art installation called Text Rain, and this one was an installation called Screen, done in the early 2000s. Text Rain is, The Falling Letters are a poem about bodies and language, and Screen was created at Brown University in this cave. It's a room-sized virtual reality display, only really for one person at a time, and they were looking to have new reading experiences by involving the body of the reader. So yeah, so up next for me is I want to take the structure, some of the basic structure from What Should I Be, and place it in VR. This summer I'm part of the Oculus Rift's Launchpad program, and so I'll be submitting a prototype as a participant. And I'm keeping in mind some critique I've received before from What Should I Be, where one playtester said, you never have more than one line to choose from, even when there were just two. I would feel like I was creating the poem than being given it, which would, and it would, I would feel more like I was creating the poem than being given it, which would make the whole experience seem more expressive. So I want to play with the physics in Unity and in VR, and the possibility of expressing oneself through the content. And so legibility and UI in VR is a concern, and the current questions guiding me now are how does text feel in VR, and how does this relate to the form and content of a poem? So while there continues to be a bit of a disconnect between the worlds of electronic literature, digital humanities, and art games, I'm hoping that further experimentation and collaboration, through that we can tap into how the expressiveness of poetry can contribute to games and vice versa. So thank you.
Hi, people. I was feeling like everyone else was more stylish than me, so I quick changed all of my backgrounds to this lovely shade of pink. Hopefully that's legible. So yeah, I don't know, I had to come up with a title that fit the width of the screen nicely, so that's that. I'm Jerry Belich. I'm a professor of game design at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. I don't get it either. And it was a trick. So I'm also working on my MFA in experience design, which was also a trick. And I'm an experimental game designer, a lot of alt control, so kind of like Robin, that's how we got to know each other. That photo with the sliders in the background, to the far left was the back of a banner of my first hardware project that I was there with. So, and I'm a theremin musician, so we should chat, yeah. And escape rooms, you know, narrative, interactive, blah, 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 blah. So I'm going to go through a few projects, kind of like everybody, just talk about like how I approach my aesthetic and design and like what makes that experimental, because that can be kind of experimental within a space. It could be experimental for yourself and trying to understand your own kind of design methodology. So this is the Choosatron. This is the first project that I ever made. It's an interactive fiction game box. So it prints out on thermal paper, and then you get to make choices, and then it prints out the results of those, and on and on and on until you come to a conclusion, and you get to tear it off and keep it and like put it on your fridge with magnets. If it's a magnetic kind of fridge. Some don't have that, mine doesn't, and it's awful. It's just so sterile. So this is kind of how it works. You can see it, and it's great because there's no ink, and you can make your own stories, and it's wonderful. But my approach to creating the Choosatron, I think it was different than a lot of my work. At the time, I was running a mobile development team, and I was led to this by like despising other kinds of aesthetics. I was sick of mobile. I was sick of these tiny screens. I was sick of it being like, oh, everything now, every experience must be had through this tiny rectangular window. And it's like, I don't like that. I would rather be on the other side of that window. And the best way I could figure out to do that is to bring the other side here. And I think that's what brought me to hardware and experimental electronics, like immersive hardware stuff, interface, like tactile things. Is I would rather make the world that we already inhabit kind of more magical and more interesting. And one of the things about this was I just was sick of digital screens. I didn't want the glow. I didn't want that kind of nauseating feeling of like I'm waiting for a notification from whatever device I'm using, like, or Netflix is going to tell me that there's a new Orange is a New Black season out. I don't want that. I don't want that on my Kindle reader or anything else. So the other thing I really loved about this was that it produces this kind of wonderful narrative spaghetti mess. And this was kind of like through experimentation and play with lots of people, where people were encouraged to take the stories with them, but oftentimes they didn't, or they played multiple times, and maybe they kept the one that was most meaningful to them. And inevitably, at any event, it starts collecting into kind of this snowdrift. And then people like Sauce on the left here, he had found a logical loop in one of the games where by making a certain set of decisions, he would end up back at a previous node. And so he spent about 45 minutes printing out as much as he could. And that was pretty great. I really delighted in that, especially because thermal paper is really cheap. So. And this is kind of the result of just even like a few hours of people kind of going nuts with it. So this, again, it's very reductive for me. It was about removing any evidence of kind of this digital thing. So physical buttons, physical like output, physical input, all of that. And that's kind of how that was born. So kind of after that, I worked on a project called Afterglow. And this is kind of inspired by like Soviet era, Cold War kind of time period. But it didn't start there. What kind of gave me the inspiration for this and really deciding to attack this aesthetic was finding this briefcase in my attic. It looked very drab, 1960s kind of underfunded spy, I don't know, like these big heavy clasps that were really loud and clicky, and I was like, this is just so physical, and like I got really attached to the idea of like, I want there to be something in this, something really surprising and kind of exciting, or like maybe like if you're at the airport, something really scary. And so I also at the time was playing around with old rotary phones, and I happen to have this circular thing of LEDs, especially once you start getting into hardware, you realize that the best way to experiment is to just acquire things and then leave them everywhere so you look like a hoarder. And then you start finding like, oh, this kind of fits with this. And I basically noticed like, oh, these are kind of a one-to-one relationship. And so I started playing around with, like, okay, what can I do with like this rotary and moving around the space? And I was really attracted to technology that was designed under the constraints of what we couldn't do yet. And rotary phones are a great example of that. They're built like tanks because you lease them, you do not own them. Bell owned the phone, so they wanted to make sure it kept working. And you can throw those things against the wall, and your wall would fall. But like, we had to make this bizarre dial. Like, it's nonsense. It's ridiculous. There's, of course, it should just be buttons or whatever. But you know that we can do that. So we had funny dial, and I was like, okay, well, this is such an interesting interface that should never have existed, but it does. So fun. So because of that, and because of like the briefcase, I really wanted to lean into that particular aesthetic. The text you see, the hit bomb, is tiny, tiny, tiny bubble segmented displays that were used in Casio calculators. And they gave off this just fantastic glow and just really kind of eerie. So I decided to stick those suckers in there and see how that went. And then I was really starting to think about, like, how do these different pieces kind of intersect? And that's how I've done a lot of the work, is getting really excited about very, very random individual components that made me think about certain things, certain other aesthetics, some things in history, things from movies, whatever, and then like seeing which ones kind of speak to each other and start influencing each other. And that's kind of what happened here. That swirl is kind of a radar display. So you would dial a certain number, and then that would do a radar sweep, and then it would show which direction there were bogeys. And those would slowly fade away, so you'd have to do another radar sweep. But if you dialed the number in the direction of the enemy, then you would shoot them down. And you see there's kind of the scope thing. Like, I really wanted this to be a very isolating experience in kind of two ways. One, like the player from everybody around them. So like that's all you see is this weird, eerie glow in front of you, and you're very focused on what you're doing. But also this weird isolation from the act you're committing. You're basically bombing people. Like, you're just kind of completely separated because of the abstraction of this technology, where it's that minimalism that probably both makes it psychologically easier to commit these acts, where it becomes more like this game, becomes more like those early arcade games that we'd play, like missile, defense and all that. And there was a part of this kind of a discomfort that I was playing around with, and I've since gotten this really awful old set of headphones that I want to pump into that. It'll bring sound into the equation to really kind of finish it off. And the other thing, back to the briefcase part, was having something that was completely portable. So it's something I could bring and slap onto a table, click open up, and somebody could play right there. And I did that at a few bars or parties I snuck into at GDC, which was really fun. Since I'd done Choosatron, I was still fascinated with thermal printers. And one thing I really wanted to capture, because the play had turned into something that felt very much like early arcade games. Just play till you lose. You're going for the high score. I got 66 kills, you got 75, yay. And that idea of social play with people you might never meet. You both happen to go to the same arcade, you're both playing the same machine, and you're like, who the hell is JDW? I gotta beat it. And the only way I can think of capturing that is because it's not going to stay in one place. So it's actually online. So it has an online high score. And if you get a high score, no matter where the game is in the world, it will then put that online onto the high score list, and it will give you a little ticket. You actually use the rotary to put your initials in, which worked out really well because it's already got the letters and everything. And so that way I was able to try and kind of connect to that arcade social experience, similar to how we have now, where you're playing Fortnite with people you've never met, and except, lo-fi. I guess I gotta rush through these. This is Please Stand By. So at this point, I was very fascinated with old technology. And with this one, it went a little further than the rotary phone. So it wasn't just about old technology and reusing the interfaces they already had, as nonsensical as they might be. but also tapping into how we had to misuse them. And with TVs, I think that was big. You're hitting the side of the TV, it's not working right, you're having a fiddle with the rabbit ears, you're dealing with all of these weird problems. And for this one, I was just like, I want an old TV. I don't know what I'm going to make with it, but that part is really, really important. And I ended up with this 1950s Cape Heart television. And I'm still using the original rabbit ears that are now 70 years old that I stuck potentiometers in so I can sense their angles. And the original, a lot of the original potentiometers and the front controls and all the knobs and everything. And so this part was interesting. This is for future storytelling in New York. And they went so overboard with dressing the space. So when you talk about like experimental aesthetic, like I think at this point it's almost lost in what's going on. Like, why do you play the TV? I have no idea. Maybe I want to play the banjo or the rotor or the payphone that's off in the corner. So I think there's kind of a failure there in overdoing it, too much noise. So here's just kind of showing, it's lots and lots of shaders in Unity to make bunches of TV effects. And the final thing I'm going to talk about really, really quick, because my time's up, is Utopia Room. This is an escape room I designed, built from scratch, all the hardware, the technology, with my design partner David Pisa in Minneapolis at a place called Riddle Room. And this was a really interesting experience. It was my first one. We ended up winning an award, which was really cool last year. And this is the only photo I can show of it, but I think it kind of says a lot. Like when we were approaching designing an escape room, we were looking at what other people are doing, what we felt that they were doing wrong, and we noticed that there's always a lot of clutter. There's a lot of red herrings, and there's just a lot of stuff. So the first like X number of minutes of the game, you're running around and just examining everything. We're like, what if we just blank? What if you walk into the room and there's just absolutely nothing? And it becomes about the reveal. It becomes like opening up new surprises over and over and over until by the time it's done, it's chaos. And so we ended up going with kind of this dystopia feel of that you're being brought into this room to be reconditioned because you're not happy enough, and we need everybody to be happy. So yeah, even behind you, it's the same. It's all uniform walls. It's this middle pedestal, and then this kind of glowy, weird ceiling, and then like everything happens. And I thought that was really, really exciting because a lot of people said the same thing, going into this space and almost feeling a little let down, and then like just constantly being blown away by like all of this new, like fresh stuff happening to them, and them being forced to like understand it together. Which kind of the final thing there is like we also really wanted people to need each other. And instead of like we all run into a room and then everybody runs to independent puzzles in different corners and then works on them and kind of reports back. We wanted people to be like really discussing and being a team on it. So yeah, that's an escape room. And this is a picture of blueberries, which I think illustrates everything I've said so far. But my point here is simply that like aesthetic is very much a filter in which people are going to engage with and experience things. And so understanding that aesthetic and understanding how you're getting to that really allows you to change the way they do that. So this is a pile of blueberries, and there were some unripe ones, and I decided to put them all in a little pile, and then it looked like they were overheating. And I thought that was interesting. Like, they're just going to go thermonuclear, little blueberries. I don't know. I thought it was cool. I just like blueberries. So thank you. I guess I'm out of time. Right now I'm working on a weird ant simulation. Don't think we can show that, though. And then as far as like VR experimentation, because it's such a freaking interesting space to experiment, we did something called Ghost Dentist, where you do dentistry on yourself in VR. And then I made a mask with vibrational motors in it so you can feel against your teeth where you're drilling. And it has a stretch sensor. It's the same rubber band Robin used, so like when you're opening and closing your mouth, like it opens and closes one-to-one in the VR. And we just showed it off in Berlin, and people loved hating it. It was really great. All right, thank you very much.
What's up? Hi, so I'm TJ Hughes. I'm from here, St. Louis. I'm making a game called Noor. Hopefully you've seen it out in the demo hall. I'm talking today about just the aesthetics and of Noor and how I sort of try to achieve that. And yeah, just basically how I cooked up some very nice 3D models that you see here. A bit about Noor. Noor is an experimental food art game. There's no goals or objectives. You're just kind of playing with your food just as if you're a kid again, except your mom can't yell at you. There's no mess to clean up. It's all virtual. The game intends to make you hungry by just showing you various foods. It'll show you like ramen, boba tea, popcorn, just like various foods, and you can just play with them, mash buttons. The game won't yell at you with objectives or time limits or anything like that. Noor is, to my knowledge, the only video game where you can question the ethics of throwing a hoverboard into a meat grinder and have it come out the other end as noodles. So needless to say, this game is experimental in both its approach, like conception, development, and art direction, for real. I'm talking about, yeah, just the aesthetics. It's crucial to what makes Noor Noor. It's a very colorful game, very much like how I'm like dressed now. Like I try to incorporate the color not only in in the game itself, but in the whole brand that I put behind the game. So beyond that, I'll be talking about just like 3 kind of secret ingredients that that are important to Noor's aesthetic. So the first, I would say, could you go back to the subsurface scattering slide? One before that? Yeah, so the first kind of technique I use is subsurface scattering. And so the best way I could probably describe that is just when you take a flashlight and like put it up to your hand, and then like you kind of see that your hand glows red. Like anyone ever do that as a kid? Like, I don't know, I was a really bored kid. But yeah, that right there, like you might not know what that's called, but we just inherently find that neat, right? Like it's just like, whoa, it's red, what? Like I thought this flashlight was white. But what's happening there is the light rays are going from the flashlight, they're hitting the surface, they're like penetrating the surface of your finger and like interacting with that material, and then it comes out the other end as red because like we're fleshy beings, right? And so I think what subsurface scattering does is it creates, it makes something seem fleshy. And so you can do this in real time, or you can approximate this in real time because it's quite an expensive thing, or it's quite a like interesting effect to try to pull off in 3D graphics. And so I have a shader that can approximate this, and this is what I use in Noor in order to create just kind of a food-looking thing. So yeah, you see on the left, that's with it off. That's with just like the standard Unity shader. It's just like it pretty much is treating the noodles the same as if they were like metal or something, or just like some material that isn't like very hard. But on the right here, yeah, that's with subsurface scattering enabled. You can see it gives it a much more of a like saturated color. And I think that's really the secret to making food look kind of like food, is just making it really saturated, vibrant, and like to where you can almost kind of see the light passing through it. Next, please. I go through extreme lengths to get textures. So that is a picture of a piece of bread inside of a scanner that I picked up from Goodwill. I promise you that I cleaned it out after I did this. Used up like a whole can of compressed air. But anyway, so yeah, that was just like a really good way to actually get the texture. Like I didn't think that would work at first, but it actually turned out to be like, this is a great way to just pull a texture off of an object. It's flat, you can just put it in there. And like a scanner is like, it's really neutral. Like there's no lighting to throw it off. You can use it perfectly as a material inside of a game. Then you can like take it into Photoshop or whatever, repeat it, and like do whatever you want with it. But I use that texture and I set up a full PBR material. So PBR is physically based rendering. Pretty much that's just when a computer will, it'll treat a material as if it's being lit almost by real world physics almost. So like it actually factors in reflections, any ambient lighting that might be around, like indirect lighting. It takes all that into account and just gives you basically, yeah, just bread. It's like somewhat realistic looking bread. Here's an example of subsurface scattering on some citrus fruits that I just like went to the store one day and got some citrus fruits, took pictures of them. These I did not put in the scanner, unfortunately. They were like too small to get a good texture from. But yeah, you can see that like I was able to get a glossy reflection off of them and all that just by like putting those in. Using like all from one texture, I'm able to extract like all this information to make it look like passable, I think. Bitmap to Material is a program I use so that you can take any texture, so any texture you can just put into this program and it'll fully create that PBR material I was talking about, and it'll create all the different kind of maps that you might need. So that includes like normal maps, height maps, specular maps. Like these sound like super like buzzwordy, but they're like understanding what all of those can do to make an object look realistic. Like if you just understand a few basic concepts, then it can really make a strong look. Unconventional lighting setup. So this is just kind of how I set up the lighting in Noor. I just set up a bunch of just like spotlights and stuff that's like kind of off camera. And like even though you won't see any of this, it actually really influences the objects that you see in the scene. It'll like create these nice reflections, and like it's similar to what a restaurant will do in their photography. They'll just like set up a bunch of lights, like they'll set up their food in a very nice lighting situation, and so then like, yeah, when you see that in the promotional images, you're just like, oh yeah, I want to eat that. And so like because game engines have gone so far with like physically based technology, rendering technology, and yeah, just photorealistic rendering and stuff like that. These are things like we can actually start taking influences from other mediums like photography and just like other mediums that of creation. Beyond that, let's see, I think I'm short in time here. But yeah, you'll notice that kind of infinite gradient background that I have in throughout my scenes, and like throughout Noor, you'll see this several times actually. But that is also a tip that I kind of just stole from photography. Yeah, because as you can see in this like scene, like this is something that's done often. Yeah, like the lights I was talking about earlier, that's kind of simulating those box lights that you see. And the infinite gradient background, yeah, it's literally just a piece of paper just like warped. And so in my game, I just have a flat, or just a plane that kind of warps upwards. And it just looks like this infinite color, and it just leaves this like nice soft gradient. And so yeah, it's just interesting to me how, yeah, technology and just like rendering is good enough to where we can just start stealing tips from these other mediums and just implementing them into art styles. And beyond that, yeah, that's here's the back of my business card, because yeah, it's there. I don't feel like making a sign-off card, but yeah, that's just 3 kind of secret ingredients to making your 3D models look pretty tasty, actually.